The mineral war has officially begun. Welcome back to the National Security Series on the Next News Network. This week, the United States and the European Union signed a deal to break China's grip on critical minerals, the materials that power everything from missiles to microchips. Now, for decades, China didn't just mine these resources, they actually controlled the processing, they controlled the refining, they controlled the supply chain, and that meant only one thing: they controlled the leverage. Now that's starting to change. Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, just signed a new agreement with European leadership to secure mineral supply chains outside of China's control. But here's the real question: is America actually ready to take that control back? Well, Craig Perry from Vizsla Copper is back with reaction. Let's get right into it. Craig, welcome back. This week we saw a major move. The U.S. and EU sending a deal to secure critical minerals and reduce dependence on China. Let's take a look real quick with Rubio and the EU doing the signing and Rubio's remarks.
The importance of supply chains and critical minerals to the success of our economies and to our national security, for that matter. The over-concentration of these resources, the fact that they're dominated by just one or two places, is an unacceptable risk. We need diversity in our supply chains, diversity in the places we get critical minerals. And this memorandum of understanding, which isn't just going to be a piece of paper, it's going to be brought to life through real actions, are going to be important for the economic vibrancy of all of our economies, the global economy really, but also to the security of our countries. And so today is a very important gathering between, if you look at the buying power, the economic productivity power of the combination of the United States and the European Union, it's extraordinary. We are combined the largest customers and users of the world, but we have to ensure that these supplies and these minerals are available for our futures, and in ways that are not monopolized in one place or concentrated heavily in one place. We have to have a reliable, affordable sources for this. And so this is a very important achievement. We thank you for being a part of this today, and we look forward to working with you on it as you operationalize it with our trade representative and our Department of Commerce in the West and in Europe.
So there they are. We've got some significant developments. So from your perspective, how significant is this moment?
Well, that's great. It's a step in the right direction. But some might say way too little, way too late. I'm just looking at a list here of, critical minerals that China's share of production of critical minerals. We've talked in the past, Gary, about the F-35 fighter jet being a flying periodic table of elements. Well, you look at some of those key elements in defence technology, particularly optic and radar technology. Things like gallium, magnesium, niobium, things that a lot of people have never heard of. China produces 90% of those. I don't think the EU produces much of those at all, much less the US. So I think, it's a very strong indication that Rubio and the US government understands the challenges it has ahead of it. But this is not going to do much. This is not going to bring that production out of China into the US because it doesn't exist in Europe. So I think it's a drop in the ocean. I think it's a step in the right direction. It's an indication that the White House understands the challenge that they have ahead. But if you look at the top, even the top 20 key critical minerals, China produces over 60% of those, every single one. So if we are at war, and we're at war with China in that sense, you need a little bit of history to understand why and how this has come about. Of course, the last mining boom, which kicked off in about 2000 and went through to 2011, that was driven by a large but largely localized factor, and that was the urbanization of a large chunk of the Chinese populace. And China went global in terms of mineral development. We saw them. I was working at Rio Tinto, in second biggest mining company in the world, in 2005. We saw them come into some of our projects at that time and partner with Rio Tinto. No other Western companies much were doing that at that time. You saw China invest massively into Africa, where there is strong mineralogy. There are great rare earth and critical mineral deposits in Africa. And they built towns and they built bridges and they built hospitals and they won the war for African mineral resources, if you like. And that's why they have such a strong lock on not only the refining and smelting of these critical minerals, but also that front end of the supply chain coming from some of the world's great deposits in difficult places like the Congo. And so you end up in a situation, and in the West, smelting, of course, was a dirty word. Smelters can be, very big, messy things. And we've been trying to shut those down around the world. And you see, as a bit of a proxy for what's going on, you see other nations around the world, like Australia, is in a perilous state now because we closed all of our oil refining capacity over the last 50 years. We've done the same. We haven't, we've had some capacity in the West, but we've really farmed it out to China. And I don't, you're going to have to see massive amounts of investment, both at the very pointy end where I am, like at Vizsla Copper, where we're drilling out a couple of major copper and critical mineral resources now. You need to see US government investment in that, into those projects. But very importantly, you need to see development of refining capacity within the US and within Western nations. So I suppose this is a step in the right direction, but gee, it's a drop in the ocean when you consider that China is producing by far and away the bulk of the things we need.
So, okay, you bring up China because clearly they've dominated not just mining, but processing, refining for decades. So how did they build that level of control over the whole supply chain?
So if you look at Western companies, we're driven by investor returns, and of course the mining industry is a cyclical industry. The copper price, if you go back 20 years ago, was 60 cents. It's now $6, but it's been, it'll tend to dip down to $3, and that really makes a very difficult, challenging situation for companies to invest in mining and those refining capacities, because invariably a lot of these producers will go broke during the next downturn, and so there's been disincentive to encourage development of mines and refineries. China doesn't view things that way. China, I've been doing business with and in China, and indeed lived in China for 2 years in 2006 and 7. And what I learnt was that they view these projects, they view mineral security very differently to what we do in the West. And they take what's called a value in use approach. So they might buy a ton of iron ore for $100, and that will be a loss-making proposition if they were to try and sell that into the market. But because they have such strong capacity to treat those minerals within China, they view the value of the end product as the contribution to the nation and to their investors' wealth. So they really it allows them to develop projects that won't be profitable at every stage of the cycle, but will deliver them those minerals they need. In the West, we don't. We are obliged to invest throughout the cycle when prices can drop pretty dramatically and make refining unprofitable. So I think the biggest news that we're seeing is serious talk coming out of the White House of putting in place pricing that would underpin the economics of these projects going forward, so that we can get on and develop them successfully without market vagaries, market nuances causing these projects to be shut down. So there's a huge amount of challenges, both economically and in terms of the mining industry, to get our heads around this new paradigm. But I think we're absolutely going to have to see price floors brought in place for things like, gallium, tungsten, bismuth, things that we're not actually actively out there exploring for. We have to create an incentive to develop these projects.
So when people hear that we have minerals in the ground, they just assume that we're secure, but that's really not the full picture. Where are the real vulnerabilities for the United States right now?
You'd have to say that copper supply is a major issue. Copper, of course, I think is the most critical of all minerals. Like, you look around you in the studio or where in my office here, nothing works. Lights don't come on, nothing. We can't live without copper. And at the moment, the bulk of the US's copper is from external sources, places like Chile, particular Peru, and indeed the DRC. So, pretty good jurisdictions generally, but there's no security of supply there. And what the US has done, and most other Western nations, has implemented permitting regimes that take huge amounts of investment and time, way more than China would ever insist on their projects. So we're not competing with Chinese producers on a level playing field, and that's what needs to be fixed.
Okay, so you've said before that mining alone is not enough. Can you walk us through precisely why processing precisely and refining are actually the real choke points in the system? I mean, you mentioned smelting earlier.
Well, yeah, Gary, you were up at our recent Thera discovery, where we're getting some fabulous drill results out of central British Columbia here. Now, that core comes out of the ground. It's at 0.4% copper, so it needs mill processing and internal processing before you produce a copper concentrate, and then that copper concentrate goes to smelters around the world. Now, the bulk of those smelters are in China, so despite producing that copper out of the ground as a concentrate, and the concentrate might have percents up to 10% copper in that concentrate, that then gets shipped to a smelter and a refiner. And the bulk of those are in China. We need to see more smelting and refining capacity built in the Western world, and that's tricky to do. No one really wants to make that investment. So I think we're going to absolutely have to see government intervention and investment in refining and smelting capacity. And it's not a cheap thing. If you look at the last great rare earth mineral refining project that was built outside of China, I think it was built in Malaysia by an Australian company. That was a sort of $2 billion US investment, and still hasn't delivered that much metal to the world. We probably need 10 of those to be built around the world. And so you've got to go out and find upwards of $20 or $30 billion to do that. And investors are reluctant to do it because of the cyclical nature of pricing of minerals. So there is a heck of a lot of work, a lot we've got to do. We have to change our view of how these projects get developed. We have to shorten timelines in terms of permitting, and we have to encourage investment in that refining and smelting space.
So we're seeing a shift, policy agreements, coordination with allies. How do moves like this U.S. EU deal actually begin to change the balance of power? Because you're a little cynical with respect to what the EU is actually capable of.
Well, the less said about the EU, the better. I'm still, a bit of a ludder. Well, bit of an anachronism in that sense. I can't understand why you would give sovereignty of your nation and your nation's wealth and minerals up to a bunch of bureaucrats in Brussels, but here we are. I don't know that this sort of agreement will do much. We may see Rubio encourage development of refining and smelting capacity in the US. That would be a big in Europe. That would be a big help. I know that a lot of if you look at France now as an example and a proxy for the rest of Europe, you're starting to see encouragement by governments, by the French government, into mineral exploration and development once again. But I suspect that the permitting timelines for a project in any part of the EU will be tens of years, decades, not years to get done. So I suppose this sets the US and EU on a footing to do that, but that's going to happen over many, many years. I really think. And the US government is starting to do this now. You're seeing investment from the Department of War, from the Department of Commerce and Energy into mineral projects. And we're starting to see talk of a base price being put in place for some of these critical minerals. And that's great. That will go a lot of the way to doing that. But of course, we're up against it in the fact that we've been through a downturn for mineral development and mineral production for for the past 15 years, coming off the back of that boom that was driven by China. This time round, our boom, the mining boom that we're at the nascent stages of, is driven by a lack of investment in the supply side. Demands continue to increase pretty substantially, and as you've seen data center development particularly come online in the US, demand for copper's really picked up in the US, but we still haven't seen that enough development internally in these countries, and partly driven by the very slow nature, a very slow approach to permitting that we've seen from Western governments.
Now, under the Trump era initiatives, there has been a push towards onshoring, some permitting reform, infrastructure. Are we finally seeing a real pathway, though, to regain control?
I think we're getting close, and I think that the rhetoric, perhaps the commitment, is absolutely there. Of course, the US established the Energy Dominance Council, National Energy Dominance Council, and did a very good job of appointing a fellow there called David Cowley as the head of the minerals part of the National Energy Dominance Council. So you're starting to see the US put in place the sort of social infrastructure, if you like, and the elements of government that will encourage this. I think, what we are seeing, and this is pleasing news, Vizsla Copper, my team were in Washington, D.C. last week. We got a very good audience with some of the departments, particularly the Department of Energy, but also the Alaskan senators, and they all are starting to understand the magnitude of the problem that we have. And they're very encouraging towards investment in mineral projects, particularly in Alaska. Of course, we've got our incredible Palmer project up in Alaska that we're looking for Washington White House support, and we're starting to see that come through. So I think that there's hope. I think
just if I could just jump in, because you did get the endorsement of the Alaska governor on that project.
Mm-hmm. And indeed, and Governor Dunleavy took our case to Washington back at the end of February. And so everyone's well aware of what we're trying to do in Alaska. And we're not on our own. Of course, there are a number of other explorers and developers and indeed producers. Teck is up there with their Red Dog mine, which is the largest zinc mine in the world. So, it's a great place for mineral development. But we really have to see, it's the same message that I make to the Canadian government, the Australian government. You have to allow us to move through and permit projects much quicker than you are. Now, even in British Columbia here, we've got a fairly socialist government, but they've recognised the problem, and we're starting to see permits come through much more quickly. Now, I'm heavily involved in a company called Skeena here. And this is an interesting example. We have a massive gold mine that we're building called Eskay Creek. We only can build that project with the support of the First Nations in that area. But we had to go and they had a right of veto over the project. So we had to lobby very hard the Tahltan First Nation to get that done. That probably added 2 years to the timeline for development of a simple project. So we discovered the new resource there at about 2016-17. Very simple mine, nothing new or technologically difficult about building that project. But it's taken us 10 years to get to this point where we're milling in production on a simple project. A more complicated, larger project that will require larger amounts of capital. The average time for a Canadian project to get permitted today is about 17 years. Not happening quickly enough. China will go to the Congo and very quickly, by hook or crook, develop a copper project in a fraction of the time it takes us to do it in the US or Canada. So we're up against it.
It's just remarkable when you think about the national security aspect here and these governments dragging their feet, and it puts them at a major disadvantage when you have a nation like China that's willing to just, they're going to jump the line, they're going to remove all the bureaucracy because they recognize what's going on. And here we are, playing around with, these endangered species lists and all these things, which of course I understand there is a need to have respect for the ground and for, these different elements. But, how do you, we've got a national security crisis happening right now, and you've got mountains of paperwork. So when you zoom out, really, it's not about just resources, it's about the national security, the technology, economic survival. So what is at stake if America fails to secure the supply chain?
Well, China could cut off supply of the top 10 minerals it refines, and you won't be able to build a drone or a plane. It's urgent, I think. I really, and I think, this sort of situation leads to a suboptimal outcome. One of the things we do very well, Western mining companies generally nowadays, very considered. We take a very considered approach. We do a heck of a lot of environmental studies. We study our projects to the death so that we can build those projects in the most sustainable way possible. China doesn't need to do that. They can make investment decisions without having studies done. They can build projects very cheaply, and indeed will not follow the same permitting regulations that we have to in Western nations. So, we're competing against a team that isn't playing by the same rules as us. And so I think, and of course, we're coming from a low base because you haven't seen much mineral development in the US in the last 20 or 30 years. And indeed, David Cowley, when he was at the National Energy Dominance Council, said that we need to start paying attention to our miners. You don't have the people in positions of power that can assess projects quickly enough. We don't have the engineers, environmental scientists, these key people within government at the moment to do that. So you basically got to train up a whole new cadre of bureaucrats that can quickly assess these things. So we're coming from such a low base. I wouldn't say it's desperate, but it's not great.
Well, we've got Marco Rubio there, putting the first feet forward, signing these deals. Of course, we had the big critical minerals summit a few months back, and the White House signing executive order after executive order. So clearly, there is positive movement. So my final question for the Patriots who are watching, what does this moment represent? Is this the beginning of America reclaiming control, or are we still behind?
I think it's a good start. We're a long way behind China. We're 30 years behind China.
Oh,
so
boy.
we've got to do something in the next 5 years that bridges that 30-year gap, the 30-year head start that China has on us. Certainly, we've seen a commitment from the White House, and I think our friend Robert Friedland, great mining entrepreneur, billionaire. I've spent a fair bit of time on stage with Robert over the years. He's a great leader of our industry. We saw him in the White House next to Trump there a few weeks back, and so we're starting to get an audience. So that's a nice change. That's a pleasant change. But we've got a long way to go. We need more drilling, we need more resource development, and we need to really look hard at that refining and smelting capacity internally. We can't farm it out to China any longer.
Well, Craig, I want to thank you for joining us on the National Security Series, and we thank you for supporting our work here at the Next News Network. And I know that a lot of our viewers are asking questions. They're taking a look at the paperwork. They're making the right choices to get plugged in with you. Any final thoughts on that front before we go?
Look, it's such an interesting time. I think that we remain at the start of what will be the biggest boom the world's ever seen, and we're going to have that boom in the West. We need to see mineral development in the US, in Canada, and Australia, and much more of it, and much more support for investment in the sector. We need to reduce timelines very, very dramatically, but we have to do everything right still. We can't, pay lip service to the environment. Historically, the mining industry has got something of a bad rap. Things have changed. Mines aren't, these big, horrible, terrible things that people will have you believe these days. There are, very sustainable ways of developing mineral projects. We need to get out. We need to encourage mining companies and explorers to get on and do that. And we need to start encouraging investment in that smelting sector. And in the meantime, guys like me will be out there drilling as much copper and as many of these critical mineral deposits as we can, as quickly as we can, to support this effort. And so, we want to see that continued and ongoing support.
All right, Craig, thank you so much. We look forward to having you back, giving us an update in the future on the Vizsla copper projects. And hopefully we can get out to Alaska. We can check out the Palmer project. That'd be really cool. So thank you so much for joining us.
Real pleasure, Gary. Thank you.
So Patriots, you just heard it. For decades, global powers controlled the minerals that America depends on. China didn't just mine the resources, they controlled the refining, the processing, the entire supply chain, and that gave them leverage over everything. Defense, technology, infrastructure, and now for the first time in years, that grip is being challenged. The United States and the European Union are moving to secure supply chains, favor allied producers, and break dependence on China. But here's the reality. It's not finished, because mining alone is not enough. Without processing, without infrastructure, without execution, the vulnerability remains. Now, Craig's been warning about this for years, and now the world is finally waking up. The question is, can America move fast enough to take back control? Craig will be back for episode 5, Patriots. This is the Mineral War, and it's just getting started.